Chapter mostly consists of a rant against inherited titles, inherited nobility, and the Catholic Church. Now, this is a bit of an anachronism because at the point of this mid 1600s, late 1600s, or sorry, mid 600s, late 600s, the church had just barely spread into England at this point. Got to understand that the Roman Empire was still somewhat holding it together at this point. They kind of lost control over England to the Picts and the Celts. And the Vandals were roaming through Europe, and all of these Germanic tribes were taking over. But at this point, though, the church wasn't a big centralized hierarchy like it became later on. He's railing against a church that didn't really exist and wouldn't really exist for another 500 or 600 years. So this is kind of a weird thing for him to be ranting against. He's ranting against inherited nobility titles, which is something that the founding fathers hated. During the War of Independence, the U.S. Revolution, there were diplomats and such from England who were like, okay, end this nonsense, become good citizens, and we'll hand out titles of nobility. And they were going to promote George Washington to be like a duke. They were going to elevate America to the status of England and Scotland and Wales, where they would be part of the kingdom. They would have their own nobility. So Thomas Jefferson was offered, George Washington was offered. A lot of the important people were offered these titles of, okay, you will be Duke of this huge section of land, and they were going to promote them to nobility. And the founding fathers were like, no, we don't want to be kings. We don't want to live in a land of kings. And that was written into the Constitution. So American citizens cannot have titles of nobility without the express permission of Congress. So if Meghan Mountbatten Windsor, I believe that's her official name now, née Markle, who married Prince Harry, if she wanted to be referred to as princess, that would take an act of Congress to allow her to be that inside of America. So there's it's actually in the Constitution, there will be no titles of nobility. You can only accept them from a foreign power with an act of Congress. So that was how anti-noble these people were. And a lot of the divine right of kings and such was kind of a slow burn and slow build-up, because 1100s, 1200s, you had things like the War of the Roses. You had people who were claiming to be kings fighting it out with other people claiming to be kings. You had kings executing each other. Then again, a little bit later, you had popes excommunicating each other, and all sorts of struggles like that, where people were fighting and fighting and fighting. And you had the people who line up on one side and people who line up on the other side. This even completely ignores things where the royalty in England was tossed off for a while. After a line of succession, after Queen Elizabeth, King James was beheaded by a commoner. They took Parliament and they said, okay, no more kings. And then a little bit later, you had the Restoration, where all of the people who went and killed the king were then executed, strung up. Cromwell's head was actually displayed in public. He had died a couple years earlier, and they dug him up and said, okay, we're going to... Which is kind of like what the popes did, who when they had their wars against each other. There was one guy who they dug up to put on. There was one pope who was dug up to put on trial, so he could then be burned for heresy. But so this gets a lot of things wrong, and it has a lot of rage in there about how bad it is. But the thing is that it was never really that serious. In a lot of books that deal with a similar circumstance, where you have somebody from a modern world going over into a primitive medieval past, quite often the people just claimed, "Oh, I am blah blah blah. I am Count of distant land that you've never been to." So, and the author here admits, I could easily say I was the Count of Concord, New Hampshire, or I was the Duke of Massachusetts. And, they'd hear Massachusetts and have no idea of what that was, because Massachusetts is based off an Indian word, and North America wasn't discovered for another 1,000 years, 900 years. So you could say, oh, yes, I'm the Duke of Massachusetts. Concord did recognize, because that was named after a town in England. But, if I were to say Duke of Massachusetts, Lord of Hopticong, or let's see, in any of the Native American names, Nebraska. Yes, I am the Empress of Omaha. It'd be okay. So, and as I said, in a lot of the other books that I've read, people have said, oh yeah, I am blah, blah, blah. I am Baron of far off place. And sometimes they get promoted and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just get treated as the whatever lord. The example I'm thinking of is from a book called The George and the Dragon, which has a very similar thing, except it is heavy with real magic. And through real magic, a modern person gets put into a magical kingdom in the body of a dragon. And so you have this whole big thing about this is the dragon. And he says he has some title. And then throughout the course of the book, he ends up overthrowing an evil person with that similar title. And the king says, well, because you're already a count, and this is a count's land, would you mind giving up your territories at home and staying and being count of this castle? And he's like, sure. But that has some interesting things with magic and payment, but it's a good book. That's The George and the Dragon, Gordon Dixon. Anyway, but so oftentimes, in these sort of books, people say, oh, I am this rank, and they get treated as that. Here, he's happy to be titled the boss. And the boss is a great sort of rank because it's simple, and it's simple. The more elaborate, the more profound, the larger the title, the less important it tends to be. So you have president, big, short title, lots of power. You have vice president, longer title, less power. Secretary of State, longer title, even less power. Under Secretary of State for Crimean Affairs, even longer title, even less power, even less importance. So here you have boss. And he liked that they could use the definite article. Now, determiner or articles. There are two types of special adjectives called determiners that indicate an item or the item. The two determiners are a and the. And one of them is called the indefinite article, and the other one's called the indefinite article.
You just said indefinite twice.
I said indefinite twice? Okay, you have the definite and the indefinite. A is the indefinite article because it's undefined as to what you're talking about. You can have a pair of glasses. You could have a couch. You could have a picture. You could have a baron. But you have the president and you have the king. And when you use the definite article, it sets something apart as being special, as being, this is the particular one that we always talk about when we use this word. So, for instance, the park by your house may be the park because that's the only park you go to. And anything else has to be specifically clarified as I am going to Central Park. I am going to Rock Creek Park. I am going to Fresh Kills Park. But the park by your house is the park. And the king is the king. And the boss is the boss.
Wrong.